He wasn't supposed to react like that. Not here. Not after hundreds of clean sweeps. But the moment his teeth sank into that suitcase, everything changed. It was 4:47 a.m. at Terminal C, the kind of hour when the airport feels half awake, like it's breathing slow and shallow under fluorescent lights that never quite turn off. The air carried that familiar mix of jet fuel, burnt coffee, and cold metal, a scent that clung to the back of your throat if you stood still long enough. Wheels of carry-ons rattled across polished floors, distant announcements echoed overhead in calm, rehearsed tones, and somewhere far down the concourse, a child laughed before being hushed. Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes walked his usual line along the security checkpoint, posture straight, pace measured, every step quiet but deliberate. 6'2", broad-shouldered, the kind of presence people noticed without knowing why. His right sleeve was rolled just enough to reveal the edge of ink on his forearm, the outline of a German shepherd etched in black and gray, worn slightly by time, but still unmistakable. He didn't talk much on duty. Didn't need to. The job was about watching, listening, trusting what didn't speak out loud. At his side moved Rex, a 3-year-old German shepherd with a coat that shifted between sable and shadow under the artificial lights. Lean, controlled, eyes the color of burnished amber, always scanning, always calculating. Rex didn't waste energy. He didn't bark unless something demanded it. And in all the months they'd worked together, he had never been wrong. Not once. They passed the first cluster of passengers without incident. A businessman adjusting his tie, a young couple whispering over boarding passes, a tired mother balancing a sleeping toddler on her shoulder. Normal, predictable, safe. Daniel's gaze moved, not searching for trouble, but for absence, for something that didn't fit the rhythm. That's how you learn to survive. That's how you learn to listen to silence. Rex slowed. It was subtle, almost nothing. A fraction of a second where his stride shortened, his head dipped just slightly. Daniel felt it through the leash before he saw it, the tension. Shifting, the air between them tightening like a wire pulled too thin. He didn't speak. Just let the dog lead. A black suitcase rolled past on the conveyor, guided by a man in his mid-40s, average height, average build, dressed in a navy blazer that looked too crisp for the hour. Clean shoes. No scuffs. No rush. He moved like someone who knew exactly where he was going and didn't expect to be stopped. Rex stopped. No bark. No growl. Just stillness. His ears angled forward, his body locked in place. And for a brief second, the world seemed to narrow around that single point. Daniel followed his line of sight. The suitcase. Nothing about it stood out at first glance. Standard size. Hard shell. No visible damage. A tag hung from the handle, printed clean, edges sharp, untouched. Too untouched. Then it happened. Rex stepped forward, slow, deliberate, nose hovering inches from the case, drawing in the scent like he was reading something written beneath the surface. His breathing changed. Subtle, deeper, focused. Daniel's grip on the leash tightened just enough to ground himself. Around them, the airport kept moving. No one noticed. No one ever did. Not at first. The man with the suitcase glanced down briefly, then away, too quickly. Just a flicker. Just enough. Rex didn't signal the way he was trained to. No sit. No alert posture. Instead, something older took over. Something quieter. He leaned in, and without warning, his jaws closed around the edge of the suitcase. Not aggressive. Not wild. Controlled. Precise. Like he was holding it in place, like letting it go wasn't an option. The wheels of the conveyor hummed beneath them, but the suitcase didn't move anymore. Daniel's heartbeat slowed instead of rising. That was the difference between fear and training. He didn't pull Rex back. Didn't correct him. Because Rex had never done this before. Not like this. A nearby agent looked over. You got something? Daniel didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the dog, on the tension in his shoulders, the way his muscles held steady without shaking. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't error. This was certainty. The man in the navy blazer forced a small smile, adjusting his cuff like it mattered. Is there a problem, officer? His voice was smooth. Practiced. Too smooth. Daniel finally spoke, calm, even. Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside for a moment. The man hesitated. Just a fraction. Then nodded. Of course. But his hand lingered on the handle a second too long before letting go. Rex didn't release the suitcase. Not even an inch. And in that quiet space between movement and meaning, Daniel felt it, that same feeling he'd buried months ago, the one that had cost him a partner he never got back. The instinct you don't question, the one that doesn't explain itself. He looked down at Rex, then back at the suitcase, and for the first time that morning, the airport didn't feel routine anymore. It felt like something was waiting to be uncovered, something quiet, something hidden, something that had already been seen, just not by human eyes. The conveyor belt slowed with a low mechanical hum, as if even the machine sensed the shift in the air, and for a moment the entire checkpoint seemed to narrow into a single point of tension where Rex stood locked in place, his jaws firm around the edge of the suitcase, not tearing, not shaking, just holding, like he understood that whatever was inside needed to stay exactly where it was until someone chose to listen. Daniel kept his hand steady on the leash, not pulling, not correcting. Because there are moments in this job where control does not come from commands but from restraint, and this was one of them. The nearby agent stepped closer now, his expression tightening, eyes moving between the dog and the passenger who had taken a half step back, hands visible but shoulders slightly raised in a way that suggested discomfort. Not fear, something practiced, something rehearsed. "Sir, I am going to ask you again to step over here," Daniel said, his voice calm, even, the kind of tone that did not escalate, but did not invite argument either. The man complied, but there was a pause before he moved, just long enough to feel out of place, and when he did step away, his eyes flicked once toward the suitcase, then quickly back to Daniel, as if measuring something unseen, Rex's. Breathing grew deeper, controlled, his chest rising and falling with a rhythm that did not match the rest of the room, his ears still forward, his entire body aligned toward that single object like a compass locked on a true north. Daniel had seen alerts before, dozens of them, maybe more, but this was different, because Rex was not asking for confirmation, he was insisting on it. "We need a secondary scan," the agent said quietly, already signaling toward the inspection lane. Daniel nodded. Once, but his eyes did not leave Rex, because somewhere beneath the layers of training and protocol, there was a memory pressing against the surface, something unresolved, something that had taught him what it cost to ignore a dog who knew more than you did. The suitcase was carefully removed from the conveyor, Rex maintaining his grip until Daniel gave a soft, almost inaudible command, and only then did he release, stepping back half a pace but not breaking eye contact with the object, his tail still, his posture unchanged. The bag was placed on the inspection table, its surface smooth, unremarkable, the kind of item that would pass through thousands of checkpoints without a second thought, and yet now it carried a weight that had nothing to do with what it physically contained. The secondary scanner powered on with a low electronic tone, the operator adjusting the angle, running the case through once, then again, the screen flickering with outlines and densities that translated into shapes only trained eyes could read. Daniel watched the operator's face more than the screen, because reactions came faster than analysis, and for a moment, there was nothing, just the steady neutrality of routine work. "I am not seeing anything abnormal," the operator said, his voice careful, measured, the kind that tried not to influence the room. The agent beside Daniel exhaled quietly, tension easing just enough to suggest resolution. "Probably a false alert," he added, glancing toward Rex with a hint of uncertainty. Daniel did not respond. He stepped closer to the table instead, his gaze moving slowly across the surface of the suitcase, noting the edges, the seams, the way the handle sat. Slightly off-center by less than an inch, something most people would never notice, something he would have ignored himself a year ago. Rex shifted beside him, a low sound building in his chest, not quite a growl, more like a warning held just beneath the surface, a vibration you could feel more than hear. Daniel crouched slightly, bringing himself level with the case, his right hand hovering just above it without touching, as if he could sense something through the space alone. "Run it again," he said quietly. The operator hesitated, then complied, adjusting the settings, increasing the sensitivity, the machine responding with a sharper tone this time as it processed the contents. The screen flickered again, lines forming, dissolving, reforming, and for a split second, something appeared, something that did not match the rest of the internal structure, a density too uniform, too deliberate. Then it vanished as quickly as it came, There, Daniel said, not raising his voice, but the certainty in it cut through the room. The operator leaned in, rewinding the scan, trying to capture the same frame, but the image refused to settle, like whatever was inside did not want to be seen clearly. The agent frowned, stepping closer now, his earlier confidence replaced by something sharper. "Open it," Daniel said. There was a pause, the kind that stretches just long enough for doubt to take root, but not long enough to stop what comes next. The latches were released with a soft click. The sound small but final, and as the case was slowly opened, Rex moved forward again, not lunging, not pulling, just closing the distance until he stood beside Daniel, his presence steady, unwavering. The lid lifted, inch by inch, revealing the neatly arranged contents inside, clothes folded with precision, items placed exactly where they should be, everything appearing ordinary at first glance. Almost too ordinary, like a display meant to reassure. The agent reached in carefully, moving aside. A layer, then another, his hands slowing as he felt resistance where there should have been none. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, his focus sharpening as the pattern broke, as the illusion of normal began to slip. Rex let out a low, steady breath. And in that quiet moment, before anything was fully revealed, Daniel understood something he had tried to forget, that sometimes the truth does not announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits beneath the surface, patient, hidden, until the one who listens finally chooses not to look away. The agent's fingers paused beneath the second layer of fabric, not because he saw something, but because he felt it, a subtle resistance that did not belong to clothing or lining or anything that should have been there. And the room shifted again, quieter now, like the air itself was holding its breath. Daniel leaned in slightly, not touching yet, just watching, his eyes tracking every movement, every hesitation. Because the truth rarely announces itself clearly, it reveals itself in the moments when something does not behave the way it should. "There is something under this," the agent said, his voice lower than before, no longer casual, no longer certain. And with careful hands he peeled back the inner layer of the suitcase, exposing a seam that had been crafted with precision, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. Rex stepped closer, his nose hovering just above that exact point, his breathing steady but intent, as if confirming what he had already known from the beginning. Daniel felt the familiar weight of decision settle into his chest, not heavy, not overwhelming, but firm, like a hand placed on his shoulder reminding him to stay present. "Go ahead," he said quietly. The agent used a small tool to lift the edge of the seam, and for a second nothing happened, just the soft sound of fabric separating from adhesive. But then the hidden panel gave way, opening just enough to reveal a narrow compartment beneath. It was not large, not obvious, but it was deliberate, designed to be missed, designed to pass unnoticed through systems that relied on patterns and expectations. Inside, nestled carefully within the compartment, was a small insulated container, no larger than a lunchbox, matte gray, sealed tight, its surface smooth and unmarked, giving nothing away, the kind of object that could mean everything or nothing, depending on what you chose to believe. The agent looked up at Daniel, uncertainty flickering across his face, but Daniel's gaze did not waver. "Open it," he said again, his voice steady, because hesitation had already cost him once before, and he had learned that the moment you begin to doubt what you know, you lose the only advantage you ever had. The container was lifted out and placed gently on the table, the sound soft but final, and as the latch was carefully released, a faint shift in the air followed. Not a smell exactly, not something anyone else in the room seemed to register, but Rex did. His ears twitched, his body tightening just slightly, not in fear, but in recognition, like a memory surfacing from somewhere deeper than training. Daniel noticed it immediately, the way Rex's posture changed, the way his focus sharpened even further, and something in Daniel's chest stirred, something old, something unfinished. The lid opened slowly, revealing the contents inside, and, for a brief moment, no one spoke. Not because it was shocking in the way people expect, not loud or dramatic, but because it was wrong in a quieter, more unsettling way, the kind that does not fit into easy explanations. Inside the container was a carefully arranged set of items, compact, organized, each piece placed with intention, but among them was something that did not belong, something that disrupted the logic of everything else, a small breathing apparatus, no larger than what might be, used for medical support, paired with tubing and a compact oxygen cartridge, all fitted into the limited space with precision. It was not illegal on its own, not immediately alarming, but it raised a question that could not be ignored, because equipment like that did not travel hidden unless there was a reason. The agent's expression shifted again, confusion giving way to concern, and he glanced toward the passenger, who now stood a few feet away, posture still controlled, but his composure no longer as seamless as before. There was a tension in his jaw now, a slight tightening around the eyes that suggested calculation, not panic, but something close. Daniel stood slowly, his eyes moving from the container to the suitcase, then back again, mapping the pieces together, not rushing, not jumping to conclusions, because the truth was still forming, still just out of reach. Rex let out a low exhale, his gaze fixed not on the container now, but on the suitcase itself, specifically the area where the hidden compartment had been, as if the answer was not just in what had been found, but in what had not yet been revealed. Daniel followed that line of focus, his mind shifting, recalibrating. Because Rex had not reacted to the container alone, he had reacted to the entire case, to something deeper, something that still had not been fully uncovered. "Check the rest," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that did not invite debate. The agent nodded, turning back to the suitcase, his hands moving more carefully now, more deliberately, aware that what looked ordinary could no longer be trusted at face value. Around them, the airport continued to move, people passing by, announcements echoing overhead. The world unaware that something small and quiet was unfolding in the space between certainty and instinct. Daniel placed his hand briefly on Rex's back, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm, grounding himself in that connection, in that unspoken trust that had been tested once before and would not be ignored again. And as the search continued, as each layer was examined with growing precision, Daniel understood that whatever this was, it was not an accident, not a mistake, but something planned, something hidden with intention, waiting for someone who knew how to listen to find it. The agent's hands moved slower now, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what they were dealing with. Because once something breaks the pattern of normal, every detail begins to matter more than it should. He pressed along the inner shell of the suitcase, fingertips tracing the edges, testing for inconsistencies, and for a moment there was nothing. Just the hollow resistance of molded plastic and fabric stretched tight over structure. The kind of construction designed to appear seamless. But Rex did not move, did not relax, his focus still anchored to a point, slightly deeper than where the first compartment had been found, as if what they uncovered was only part of the story, not the whole of it. Daniel watched the dog instead of the case, because Rex had already proven that the truth was not always visible to the eye. And when Rex shifted his weight forward again, lowering his head and pressing his nose gently against the lower corner of the suitcase, Daniel felt that quiet certainty return, the one that did not argue, did not explain, it simply existed. "There," Daniel said softly, nodding toward the exact spot, and the agent followed his indication, pressing down, then tapping lightly, listening for the difference in sound, the subtle change between solid and hollow, and it was there, faint but unmistakable, a duller echo that did not match the rest of the case. "There is another layer," the agent murmured, more to himself than anyone else. And this time there was no hesitation as he reached for the tool again, carefully working along the seam, slower than before, more deliberate, because whatever had been hidden once was likely meant to stay hidden twice. The room had grown quieter without anyone noticing, conversations nearby fading into the background, footsteps passing but not registering, as if the world had pulled back just enough to leave this moment undisturbed. Daniel's gaze flicked briefly toward the passenger, who stood with his hands clasped loosely in front of him, posture composed, but the stillness now felt different, less controlled, more contained, like something was being held in place beneath the surface. His eyes avoided the table now, drifting instead toward the exit signs, toward the movement of other travelers. Anywhere but the suitcase that had drawn all the attention. Rex remained fixed, his breathing steady, his presence unwavering. And when the second panel finally gave way with a soft, almost reluctant release, the space beneath revealed itself slowly, inch by inch, like something that had never intended to be seen. Inside was not what most people would expect, not something immediately dangerous or dramatic, but something far more unsettling in its quietness, a carefully constructed interior compartment lined with insulation, fitted with precision, and within it, secured gently as if it mattered deeply, was a small, folded bundle wrapped in soft fabric, the kind used to protect something fragile, something important. The agent paused, his hands hovering just above it, the weight of uncertainty settling into the space between action and understanding. Daniel stepped closer, his voice low, steady. Easy, not as a command, but as a reminder, because whatever this was, it required care, not force. The fabric was unfolded slowly, layer by layer, revealing what had been hidden inside, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch, not because of shock, but because of realization, because what lay within did not match the story that had been presented at the surface. It was a small animal carrier, compact, modified to fit within the compartment, with air channels built into its sides, subtle, nearly invisible unless examined closely, and inside, barely visible through the soft mesh, was a tiny form, still, quiet, but breathing, the faint rise and fall so subtle it could be missed entirely if you were not looking for it. Rex exhaled softly, a low, steady sound that carried something deeper than training, something closer to recognition, as if this was what he had been trying to say all along. Daniel felt something shift inside him, not relief, not yet, but a clarity that cut through the uncertainty, because now the pieces began to align, the hidden compartment, the insulated container, the breathing apparatus. It was all part of a system designed not just to conceal, but to preserve, to transport something living without drawing attention. The agent looked up, his expression no longer uncertain but firm, the situation now understood in a way that demanded response. "We need to call this in," he said quietly, already reaching for his radio. Daniel nodded, but his focus remained on Rex for a brief moment, his hand resting again on the dog's back, feeling the steady rhythm beneath his palm, grounding himself in that unspoken trust that had once been broken and would not be broken again. Across from them, the passenger's composure finally shifted, just slightly, a tightening of the shoulders, a flicker in the eyes, not panic, but the recognition that something carefully planned had unraveled in a way he had not anticipated. And in that quiet, controlled space of the airport checkpoint, where everything was designed to move smoothly, predictably, one decision, one instinct, one refusal to ignore what did not make sense had uncovered something that should never have made it this far unnoticed. The radio crackled softly at the agent's shoulder as he stepped a few feet away, voice low, controlled, requesting immediate assistance without raising alarm, because in a place like this, panic spreads faster than truth if you let it. Daniel remained where he was, eyes steady, posture unchanged, one hand resting lightly against Rex's back, not restraining, just present, grounding both of them in the moment as the small carrier sat open on the table, the faint, rhythmic rise and fall inside it. Continuing, quiet but undeniable, Rex did not move closer this time, did not push or signal again, because whatever he had needed to say had already been heard, and now he stood still, watchful, his amber eyes no longer searching, but holding, as if guarding something fragile that did not belong in this place. The agent returned, accompanied by another officer, older, composed, the kind of presence that did not rush but did not delay either, and his gaze moved quickly across the scene, taking in the open suitcase, the hidden compartments, the container, the carrier, and finally the passenger, who stood exactly where he had been asked to remain, shoulders squared, expression neutral, but the stillness around him now felt heavier, less controlled, like a performance that had begun to lose its rhythm. "Walk me through it," the senior officer said, his tone even, and the agent did, concise, precise, outlining each step without embellishment, because facts carried more weight than assumptions in moments like this. Daniel listened, but his attention drifted back to the carrier, to the quiet life inside it. because everything about this situation pointed to intention, not accident, to planning that had accounted for systems, for patterns, for the blind spots of routine. The senior officer crouched slightly, examining the carrier without touching it, his eyes narrowing just enough to suggest understanding, and then he nodded once, as if confirming something to himself rather than anyone else. "We are going to handle this carefully," he said, not as a warning, but as a decision already made. The passenger shifted his weight for the first time, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but enough for Daniel to notice, because change, no matter how small, always meant something. "Is there a problem?" the man asked, his voice still smooth, still controlled, but the edges of it now carried a tension that had not been there before, like a thread pulled just tight enough to be felt. Daniel met his gaze briefly, not confrontational, not accusatory, just steady. "We are still assessing," he replied, because the truth did not need to be rushed. It revealed itself whether people were ready or not. Rex's ears flicked once, then settled again, his attention no longer fixed solely on the suitcase, but moving between the carrier and the man, as if drawing a connection that had not yet been spoken aloud. The senior officer stood, straightening slowly, and gestured for the agent to secure the surrounding area without causing disruption, a quiet expansion of space that went unnoticed by most, but shifted the boundaries just enough to create room for what needed to happen next. Daniel felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle in, not heavy, not overwhelming, but clear, because moments like this were not about reaction, they were about choice, about deciding whether to trust what could not be proven yet, but had already been shown. He looked down at Rex, the dog's steady presence a reminder of something simple and unchanging, that truth does not always come from what is seen, but from what is sensed, from what refuses to be ignored. The senior officer spoke again, this time directly to the passenger, his voice calm but firm. "Sir, we are going to ask you a few questions." And for the first time, the man's composure wavered, not dramatically, not enough to draw attention from anyone passing by, but enough for those standing close to see it. A flicker of uncertainty, quickly masked, but present. "Of course," he said, though the words came a fraction slower than before. Daniel stepped slightly to the side, positioning himself in a way that allowed him to observe both the man and the table, because whatever answers were given, they would not be enough on their own, not without context, not without understanding the intent behind what had been hidden so carefully. The carrier remained still, the faint movement inside continuing, quiet but persistent, a reminder that this was not just about rules or procedures, but about something living that had been placed in a situation it did not choose. Rex shifted closer to Daniel's leg, not seeking reassurance, but aligning himself, ready, present, exactly where he needed to be, and in that controlled, carefully managed space, where everything was designed to function without interruption. The truth had already begun to surface, not in a single moment, but in layers, each one revealed only because someone chose not to look away when something did not feel right. The questions began simply, the way they always did, calm, measured, leaving space for answers to settle into place or fall apart on their own. And the senior officer did not raise his voice, did not lean in. He just stood there with the kind of quiet authority that made silence feel heavier than pressure. "Where are you traveling to today, sir?" he asked, and the man answered without hesitation, naming a destination, his tone steady, practiced, as if he had said the same thing many times before, but Daniel listened to the rhythm, not just the words, because truth has a cadence, and when it shifts, even slightly, you can hear it if you know what to listen for. "And the contents of your luggage," the officer continued, and again the man responded, listing items that matched what had been found on the surface, clothing, personal effects, nothing unusual, nothing that would stand out in a sea of travelers moving through the terminal before sunrise. But Daniel's gaze did not leave the man's face, because what mattered was not what he said, it was what he did not acknowledge. The compartments, the container, the carrier, all the things that had been hidden beneath layers of intention. Rex stood still beside him, no longer signaling, no longer pressing, just present, his ears relaxed but attentive, his breathing steady, as if the urgency had passed, and now what remained was patience, the kind that waits for humans to catch up to what has already been understood. The senior officer nodded slightly, absorbing the responses, then shifted his focus. Can you explain why? There is a concealed compartment in your suitcase. And for the first time, the man paused long enough for the space between question and answer to become visible, not dramatic, not obvious. But there, a hesitation measured in fractions of a second, just enough to feel out of place. I am not aware of any concealed compartment, he said finally, his voice still controlled, but something beneath it had tightened, like a thread drawn too thin. Daniel felt the familiar pull of doubt trying to surface, the part of the mind that looks for simple explanations, for mistakes, for ways to return things to normal. But he had learned that normal was often just a surface people trusted too easily. The senior officer did not react to the denial, did not challenge it directly. He simply let it sit in the air, because sometimes the absence of reaction reveals more than confrontation ever could. And the container. He continued, the equipment inside it. And again the man responded, claiming no knowledge, no ownership, his answers consistent, smooth. But now there was a pattern forming, not in what he admitted, but in what he refused to see. Daniel shifted his stance slightly, not to intimidate, not to close distance, but to align himself with the moment, because this was where decisions began to matter more than procedures. Rex's gaze moved briefly toward the carrier again, then back to the man. A silent connection drawn between the two, and Daniel understood something then, not as a conclusion, but as a recognition that the dog was not reacting to objects. He was reacting to intent, to something carried not just in the suitcase, but in the person who brought it here. The senior officer turned his head slightly toward Daniel. A brief glance, a silent question, not spoken but understood, and Daniel gave the smallest nod, not confirmation, but trust in what had been shown, in what had been uncovered layer by layer without assumption, without force. Sir, the officer said, his tone unchanged, we are going to continue this process in a more controlled area. And the words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind that shifts the direction of everything that follows. The man's posture stiffened, just slightly, not enough to draw attention from those passing by, but enough for Daniel to see it. The moment when control begins to slip, when the outcome is no longer something you can manage with calm words and steady tone. Is that necessary? The man asked. And this time there was no hesitation in the response. Yes, the officer replied, not louder, not sharper, just final. Around them, the airport continued to move, travelers checking watches, boarding passes being scanned, announcements echoing overhead. The ordinary rhythm of a place built on movement, unaware that within a few feet, something had shifted, something quiet but significant, because one decision had been made to listen instead of dismiss. Daniel placed his hand once more on Rex's back, a gesture that had become instinctive, not for control, but for connection. And Rex leaned into it just enough to acknowledge, not seeking reassurance, but offering it in return. And as the man was guided gently but firmly away from the checkpoint, as the suitcase remained open on the table, its hidden layers now exposed, Daniel understood that what had happened here was not about chance, not about luck, but about a moment where instinct was trusted, where something unseen was given the space to be heard, and because of that, something that should have passed unnoticed had been brought into the light. The hallway they moved into was quieter than the checkpoint, insulated from the constant motion of the terminal, where the sounds of rolling suitcases and distant announcements softened into a low, distant hum that barely reached the walls, and for the first time since the moment Rex had stopped, the pace of everything slowed just enough for the weight of what had been uncovered to settle fully into place. The man walked between two officers, not restrained, not rushed, but guided with a firmness that did not allow for deviation, his posture still upright, still composed. But the edges of that composure had begun to fray in ways only trained eyes would notice, a slight tightening in the shoulders, a controlled breath that lingered just a fraction too long before release. Daniel followed a step behind with Rex at his side, the leash loose, almost unnecessary, because Rex moved in perfect alignment, his presence steady, his attention divided now between the man ahead and the memory of the suitcase behind, as if both were part of the same story still unfolding. The room they entered was simple, functional, A table, a few chairs, neutral walls designed to hold conversation without distraction. And the moment the door closed, the outside world faded completely, leaving only the quiet space where truth either held or collapsed. The senior officer gestured toward the chair. "Please, have a seat." And the man complied, lowering himself carefully, hands resting lightly on the table, fingers interlaced, controlled, deliberate, as if maintaining structure could somehow maintain control. Daniel remained standing, positioning himself slightly off to the side, not confrontational, but observant. Because from this angle he could see everything: the man's face, his hands, the subtle movements that revealed more than words ever could. Rex sat beside him without command, posture relaxed but alert, ears forward just enough to signal awareness without tension. The senior officer took his place across the table, not leaning in, not pressing forward, just present, allowing the silence to stretch for a moment before speaking, because silence often invites truth to surface in ways questions cannot. "We are going to go through this step by step," he said, his voice even, measured. "And I want you to understand that this is your opportunity to clarify what we have found." And the phrasing was intentional, not accusatory, not confrontational, but firm enough to make it clear that this was no longer routine. The man nodded once, slow, controlled, but his eyes shifted briefly, not toward the officer, not toward Daniel, but toward Rex, just for a second. And in that second something passed between them, something unspoken, something instinctive, because animals do not read words, they read intent, and Rex's gaze did not waver, steady, calm, unafraid. Daniel noticed it immediately. That brief connection, and something in his chest tightened, not with tension, but with recognition, because he had seen that look before. The moment when someone realizes they have been understood without explanation. The suitcase, the officer began, was modified, and he laid out the facts again, not as accusations, but as observations, each one placed carefully into the space between them: the hidden compartments, the insulated container, the carrier, the equipment, all of it forming a picture that did not align with the man's earlier answers. The man listened, nodding slightly, but his breathing had changed now, still controlled, but deeper, more deliberate, as if he were choosing each breath instead of letting it come naturally. "I do not know how those items got there," he said, repeating the denial, but this time the words felt heavier, less fluid, as if they had to push through something to be spoken. Daniel watched his hands, because hands do not lie the way voices can, and there it was, a slight tightening of the fingers, a subtle shift, not enough to be called out, but enough to be noticed. Rex leaned forward just a fraction, not aggressive, not alerting, just acknowledging, as if confirming what Daniel already felt, that something beneath the surface had begun to crack. The senior officer did not challenge the statement directly. He simply let it settle, then asked, "Do you travel often?" A question that seemed unrelated at first, but was not, because patterns reveal intention, and intention reveals truth. The man answered, listing destinations, frequencies, his voice regaining some of its earlier rhythm, but not fully, not completely, because once something shifts, it rarely returns to exactly what it was. Daniel's gaze moved between the man and Rex, because Rex had stopped reacting to objects and had started reacting to something deeper, something tied to the person, and that was where the truth would eventually surface. The room remained quiet, controlled, the kind of quiet that does not rush answers but waits for them. And as the questions continued, steady, methodical, Daniel understood that this part was not about forcing a confession. It was about giving the truth enough space to reveal itself, layer by layer, the same way the suitcase had been opened, not with force, but with attention, with patience, with the willingness to look where others might not. And through it all, Rex remained still, present, a silent witness to something that had begun long before this moment, something that had traveled hidden, quiet, unnoticed, until a single instinct, a single refusal to ignore what did not feel right, brought it all to light. Time stretched in that room in a way it never did out in the terminal, where everything moved forward whether you were ready or not. But here, every second seemed to wait for something to give, for something unseen to finally step into the light, and Daniel could feel it building, not as tension, but as pressure, quiet, steady, like air gathering before a storm that no one had named yet. The senior officer continued with questions that seemed ordinary on the surface: travel history, purpose, connections, each one placed carefully, not to trap, but to map, to draw a line between what had been said and what had been found. And with each answer the man gave, that line grew thinner, more fragile, because consistency without truth begins to sound hollow if you listen long enough. Rex remained still, but there was a subtle shift in him now. Not movement, not tension, just a deeper focus. His gaze fixed not on the officer, not on Daniel, but on the man's hands, as if something there carried meaning beyond what could be spoken. Daniel followed that line of attention, watching the slight movements, the tightening and release, the rhythm of fingers that no longer matched the calm voice. And he understood then that Rex was not reacting to the past, but to the present, too. Something still unfolding, still unresolved. The senior officer paused again, letting silence settle, and this time it lingered longer, stretching across the table, filling the space between words. And in that silence, something shifted, not outwardly, not in a way that would draw attention from anyone passing by outside the closed door, but internally, a subtle change in posture, a breath held just a fraction too long, the smallest crack in the surface. "You mentioned you packed your luggage yourself," the officer said, his tone unchanged, "and that you have full knowledge of its contents." And the man nodded, slower now, more deliberate, as if choosing each movement with care. "Yes," he replied, but the word carried weight now, not confidence, not certainty, just effort. Daniel felt it then, that quiet alignment between what Rex had sensed from the beginning and what was now beginning to surface, not as proof, not as evidence, but as something deeper, something that does not rely on explanation to exist. Rex shifted his head slightly, just enough to break the stillness, and then he did something he had not done since they entered the room. He exhaled, a slow, steady breath that seemed to carry more than air, something almost like release, as if the moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived. The man's eyes flicked toward the dog again, not by accident, not without reason, and this time the look lingered a fraction longer. And in that fraction, something passed. Something unspoken but unmistakable. The recognition that the silence had been broken, not by words, but by awareness. Daniel stepped forward just slightly, not to close distance, not to impose, but to be present in that moment, because this was where things turned, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, when the weight of what is known begins to press against what is denied. "Sir," Daniel said, his voice calm, steady, not confrontational. "This is the moment where clarity matters." And the words were simple, but they carried something more than instruction, something closer to invitation, a chance to step out of the structure that had been built and into something real. The room remained still, the kind of stillness that does not demand an answer but waits for one. And the man's hands shifted again, fingers loosening, then tightening, as if holding on to something that no longer fit. The senior officer did not interrupt, did not redirect, because he understood that sometimes the most important part of a conversation is the space between words, the place where truth decides whether it will surface or remain hidden. Rex watched, unmoving, his presence steady, not pressing, not signaling, just there, a silent witness to something that had already begun before anyone spoke. Daniel could feel his own breath now, slower, more deliberate, matching the rhythm of the room, because this was not about control, not about authority, this was about alignment, about allowing what was already known to become visible. And then it happened, not with a sudden shift, not with a dramatic change, but with something small, almost imperceptible, the man's shoulders lowering just slightly. The tension easing not because the situation had changed, but because something inside him had. His eyes moved once more, not toward the officer, not toward the door, but toward the table, toward the space where the suitcase had once been. And for the first time since this began, his silence felt different, not controlled, not calculated, but uncertain, as if the structure he had relied on was no longer enough to hold everything in place. Daniel did not speak again, did not push, because he knew that once the surface begins to crack, it does not need force, it only needs space. And in that quiet room, where everything had slowed just enough for truth to catch up, The story that had been carried in silence was no longer as hidden as it had been when it first passed through the terminal, because one instinct had been trusted, one signal had not been ignored, and now, piece by piece, what had been concealed was beginning to reveal itself. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, like something inside the room had exhaled after holding its breath too long, and Daniel saw it before he heard it, the change in the man's posture, the way his shoulders lowered just enough to release the tension he had been carrying since the moment the suitcase stopped moving on the conveyor. It was not surrender, not yet, but it was no longer resistance either. It was something in between, something uncertain, something real. The senior officer did not rush to fill the space, did not press forward with another question, because he understood that this was the moment where words either come freely or not at all, and forcing them would only push the truth further away. Rex remained still, his presence calm, unwavering, his gaze steady on the man as if he had already seen this moment coming long before anyone else in the room. Daniel felt it too, that quiet alignment between instinct and reality, the point where what was sensed finally meets what is acknowledged. The man's hands shifted again, but this time they did not tighten. They opened slightly, fingers separating as if releasing something unseen. And when he finally spoke, his voice was different, not weaker, not louder, just honest in a way it had not been before. "It was not supposed to be like this," he said, and the words settled into the room with a weight that no denial had carried. Daniel did not move, did not react outwardly, but inside, something steadied, because this was the first step, not toward confession, but toward truth. The senior officer leaned back slightly, giving the man space. "Then help us understand what it was supposed to be," he replied, his tone unchanged, still calm, still measured. But now there was a subtle shift, not in authority, but in direction, from questioning to listening. The man's eyes dropped briefly to the table, not avoiding, not hiding, but searching, as if the answers he had prepared no longer fit the reality in front of him. "I was told it was secure," he continued, choosing each word carefully, "that it would pass through without issue, that no one would look deeper." And there it was. Not a full explanation, not yet, but enough to confirm what had already been uncovered, that this had been planned, designed, structured to move unseen through a system built on routine. Rex exhaled again, softer this time, almost imperceptible, and Daniel felt the meaning in it. Not relief, not satisfaction, but recognition, the confirmation that what had been sensed from the beginning had now been spoken, even if only partially. "Who told you that?" the officer asked, and the question did not press. It opened, leaving room for the answer to come without force. The man hesitated, not out of resistance, but out of consequence, because now the truth carried weight beyond this room, beyond this moment. "I do not know his real name," he said finally, and the words came slower now, less practiced, more deliberate. "I was given instructions, a time, a route, and told to follow it exactly." And Daniel listened, not just to the content, but to the absence of certainty, because what the man did not know was as important as what he did. The senior officer nodded once, absorbing the information, not interrupting, not redirecting, allowing the story to unfold at its own pace. "And the carrier?" he asked, his voice steady. "Did you know what was inside?" And this time the man looked up, his gaze meeting the officer's for a brief moment before shifting again, not away, but inward, as if the answer required more than memory. It required acknowledgement. "I knew it was alive," he said quietly, and the room seemed to narrow around those words, not because they were unexpected, but because they made everything that had been found undeniable. Daniel felt his hand rest more firmly on Rex's back, not in tension, but in grounding, because this was the moment where understanding moved beyond instinct and into reality. Rex did not move, but his presence deepened, his stillness now carrying something more than observation, something closer to purpose fulfilled. The man continued, his voice steady but no longer controlled in the same way. "I was told it would be safe, that it was being relocated, that I was just a part of the process." And Daniel recognized that pattern. The distance people create between themselves and their actions, the way responsibility is softened by language, by intention, by the belief that following instructions removes consequence. The senior officer did not challenge the statement, did not accuse, he simply listened, because understanding does not come from interruption. It comes from allowing the full picture to form. And now, the officer said quietly, "What do you believe?" And the question was different, not about facts, not about process, but about truth, the kind that cannot be outsourced, cannot be assigned, only faced. The man did not answer immediately, and in that silence, something settled, something final. Because the difference between what he had believed and what now stood in front of him could no longer be ignored. Daniel watched him, not with judgment, not with anger, but with the same steady presence he had held from the beginning. Because this was not about forcing an outcome, it was about allowing the truth to stand on its own. Rex remained beside him, unmoving, his quiet certainty now mirrored in the room itself, where what had once been hidden was no longer concealed, not by compartments, not by silence, not by carefully chosen words, but revealed through the simple act of listening to what did not fit, to what did not feel right, to what refused to be ignored. The question lingered in the room long after it was spoken, not because it was difficult to understand, but because it required something more than memory, something more than explanation. It required ownership, and Daniel could see the moment it settled into the man's expression, the way his eyes lost their earlier precision and softened into something uncertain, something human. "What do you believe?" the officer had asked. And now the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full, heavy with everything that had been uncovered and everything that could no longer be ignored. The man exhaled slowly, not as a release, but as if he were finally allowing himself to feel the weight of what had been carried, not just in the suitcase, but in the decisions that brought him here. "I believe," he began, his voice quieter now, stripped of the smooth edges it once held, "that I chose not to ask the questions I should have asked." And the words landed differently than anything before. Not defensive, not distant, but close, personal, undeniable. Daniel felt that shift immediately, the movement from explanation to acknowledgement, from distance to presence. And beside him, Rex remained still, his calm now carrying a different kind of energy, not alertness, not tension, but something closer to completion, as if the purpose that had driven him to stop that suitcase had now found its way to the surface. The senior officer nodded once, not in approval, not in judgment, but in recognition, because this was where the process changed, where it moved from uncovering facts to understanding intent. "And now you understand that what you carried was not just an object," he said, his voice steady, "but something living, something placed in your care whether you acknowledged it or not." And the man's gaze dropped again, but this time it did not search, it settled, as if he had finally stopped looking for a way around what stood in front of him. "Yes," he said, and the word was simple, but it held more weight than all the earlier denials combined. Outside the room, the airport continued its quiet rhythm, flights boarding, announcements echoing, lives moving forward without pause. But inside, something had shifted permanently, something that would not return to what it was before. Daniel took a slow breath, feeling the steady presence of Rex at his side, grounding him in a way that went beyond training, beyond routine, because this was not just about the job. This was about the moments where instinct becomes action, where trust becomes consequence. The senior officer stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a natural movement that signaled the next step without needing to announce it. "We are going to proceed with the appropriate process from here," he said, his tone unchanged, still calm, still measured, but final in a way that left no space for interpretation. The man nodded, not resisting, not questioning, because the path forward had already been set in motion the moment the suitcase stopped. The moment Rex chose not to move on, Daniel stepped back slightly, giving space, allowing the officers to guide the man out of the room, not with force, not with urgency, but with the quiet certainty that comes when something has been resolved, not in detail, not in full understanding, but in direction. The door opened, and for a brief moment, the sounds of the terminal returned, the distant hum of voices, the rolling of wheels, the steady movement of a world that did not know what had just unfolded behind that door. Rex stood, not waiting for a command, but moving in alignment with Daniel as they followed at a distance, their presence no longer needed in the same way, but still part of the process, still connected to the moment that had brought everything to light. As they stepped back into the corridor, Daniel glanced down at Rex, his hand brushing lightly against the dog's neck, not as praise, not as reward, but as acknowledgement, a silent understanding between them that did not require words. Rex looked up briefly, his amber eyes steady, calm, reflecting nothing but presence, and then he returned his gaze forward, ready, as always, for whatever came next. Daniel felt something settle inside him, something that had been unresolved for longer than he had allowed himself to admit, because there had been a time when he had doubted this, when he had hesitated, when he had chosen logic over instinct and paid the cost for it. But not this time, not here, not when it mattered. The hallway stretched ahead, familiar, unchanged, but Daniel knew that something within it had shifted, something quiet, something unseen, the kind of change that does not announce itself but stays with you, shaping the way you move, the way you listen, the way you choose. And as the morning light began to filter through the distant windows of the terminal, soft and pale against the polished floors, Daniel understood that what had happened here was not about coincidence, not about luck, but about a moment where something small, something easily dismissed, had been given the space to matter, and because of that, something that should have passed unnoticed had been stopped, seen, and understood, not by machines, not by systems, but by a bond that did not rely on words to be heard. The corridor carried them back into the rhythm of the airport, but something in Daniel did not return with it. Something stayed behind in that quiet room where truth had finally stepped forward, and as he walked beside Rex, the familiar sounds seemed different now, not louder, not softer, just clearer, like the noise of the world had shifted into something he could hear through instead of around. The morning had begun to take shape beyond the glass walls, a pale light stretching across the tarmac, touching the edges of aircraft lined up in stillness before movement, and for a moment, Daniel slowed. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to take it in, because moments like this do not announce themselves, they settle quietly, and if you are not paying attention, you miss them entirely. Rex walked at his side, steady as always, his gait even, his posture relaxed now, but not disengaged, never that, because for him, the work did not end with the discovery. It shifted, it softened, but it never disappeared. Daniel glanced down briefly, his hand brushing once more against the thick fur at Rex's neck, a gesture that had become instinctive over time, not something he thought about, just something that happened, a connection that did not need explanation. They returned to the checkpoint, where everything had resumed its pace, travelers moving forward, bags sliding across conveyors, voices blending into that constant hum of motion and purpose, and if anyone had noticed the interruption earlier, it had already faded into the background, absorbed by the system that kept everything moving. The agent who had first responded looked up as Daniel approached, his expression curious but composed. "Everything good?" he asked quietly, and Daniel nodded once, not offering details, not because they were not important, but because some moments are not meant to be explained in passing. They are meant to be understood over time. The agent glanced toward Rex, then back to Daniel, a small nod of acknowledgement passing between them, the kind that does not require words. Rex paused briefly at the edge of the conveyor, his gaze moving across the line of luggage, scanning, assessing, but there was no tension now, no pull, just awareness, the quiet kind that does not demand attention but never leaves. Daniel took his position again, posture settling into the familiar alignment of duty, but something in the way he stood had changed, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but internally, there was a steadiness there that had not been present before, a clarity that came from knowing he had listened when it mattered. The next bag rolled forward, then another, the routine re-establishing itself with the quiet efficiency that defined the space, and Rex moved with it, step by step, his nose hovering, his senses engaged, but without urgency. Because not every moment calls for action, some simply call for attention. Daniel watched him work, not just the movements, but the intention behind them. The way Rex did not rush, did not assume, did not skip ahead. He simply remained present, fully engaged in each second as it came. And there was something in that, something Daniel recognized now more clearly than before. A passenger approached, placing a suitcase onto the belt. offering a brief smile that Daniel returned with a small nod. The exchange simple, ordinary, but real, grounded in a moment that did not carry hidden layers or unspoken tension. The bag passed through, clean, uneventful, and the line continued. Time moved forward, measured not in minutes, but in moments, each one similar to the last, yet each one carrying the potential to be something more if you chose to see it. Daniel's gaze drifted briefly toward the far end of the terminal, where the early light had grown stronger, reflecting off polished floors, creating a quiet contrast between movement and stillness. And for a moment, he allowed himself to stand in that space between, not thinking ahead, not looking back, just present. Rex shifted slightly, stepping closer, not seeking direction, not needing instruction, just aligning, the way he always did. And Daniel understood that this quiet return to routine was not a step back, it was a continuation, a reminder that the work was not defined by the moments of discovery, but by the consistency of attention that made those moments possible. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, matching the rhythm of the space around him. And as he did, something settled fully into place, not as a realization, but as a knowing, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. The conveyor continued to move, the line continued to flow, the airport continued to breathe, and within it, Daniel and Rex moved with purpose, not searching for something extraordinary, but ready for it, because they had learned, in a moment that could have been missed, that sometimes the smallest signal carries the greatest weight, and sometimes all it takes is the decision to listen. By the time the first wave of early morning departures began to thin, the terminal had shifted into that steady mid-morning rhythm where urgency softened into routine, and Daniel could feel the change in the air, not as a sound, not as a movement, but as a kind of balance returning to a place that had briefly stepped outside of itself. The light coming through the tall glass panels had grown warmer now, stretching across the polished floor in long, pale reflections that moved slowly as the sun climbed, and for a moment, it gave the space a different tone, less mechanical, more human, as if the building itself had taken a breath. Rex continued his work with quiet consistency, moving alongside the conveyor with the same focus he had shown hours earlier. But there was a difference now, not in his behavior, but in the way Daniel saw it, because once you witness something shift from instinct to truth, you do not return to seeing it the same way again. Each step Rex took carried intention. Each pause carried meaning, even when nothing came of it, because the value was not in what was found, but in the presence that made finding possible. Daniel adjusted his stance slightly, rolling his shoulders back, not out of fatigue, but out of awareness, grounding himself again in the moment, because he understood now more clearly than before that the work was not about reacting to what stood out. It was about noticing what did not belong before it ever had the chance to become something more. A new line of passengers formed, quieter than the earlier rush, travelers moving with a calmer pace, conversations softer, movements less hurried, and with them came a different energy, one that did not demand attention but still required it. A man placed a small duffel bag onto the belt, glancing briefly at Daniel with a polite nod, and Daniel returned it, his expression neutral but present, because every interaction, no matter how small, was part of the same flow, part of the same responsibility. The bag passed through, uneventful, just like the ones before it, and Rex moved on without hesitation, without pause, because not every moment carries weight, but every moment carries potential. Daniel's eyes moved across the space, not searching for something specific, but staying open to anything that might break the pattern, the way it had before, because patterns are where comfort lives, and comfort is where things can be hidden if you are not careful. He thought briefly of the suitcase, of the layers that had concealed what mattered, and of how easily it could have passed through without notice if Rex had not chosen that exact moment to stop, to hold, to insist without words, and that thought did not bring tension, it brought clarity, because it reminded him that the system, no matter how advanced, no matter how structured, still relied on something human, something intuitive, something that could not be programmed into machines. Rex paused again, just for a second, his nose hovering near the edge of a rolling case, and Daniel felt the shift immediately, not fear, not urgency, just awareness. But this time, Rex moved on just as quickly, the moment passing without escalation, without confirmation, and Daniel did not question it, did not doubt it, because trust works both ways. It is not only about believing when something is there, it is also about accepting when it is not. The line continued, steady, predictable, and for a while, nothing broke that rhythm, nothing stood out, nothing demanded attention beyond the quiet focus that defined their work. But beneath that surface, Daniel carried something new, not heavy, not distracting, but present, a reminder that what had happened earlier was not an isolated moment. It was part of something larger, something that extended beyond this terminal, beyond this day, into the way he would approach every moment that followed. He glanced down at Rex again, the dog's movements smooth, controlled, his attention unwavering, and there was a quiet respect in that glance, not for what Rex had done, but for what he always did, consistently, without hesitation, without doubt. The conveyor hummed, the lights remained steady, the announcements continued in their calm, practiced tone, and the world moved forward exactly as it was designed to. But Daniel understood now that within that design, within that structure, there were moments that required more than procedure, moments that required presence, awareness, and the willingness to trust what could not be explained in simple terms. As another bag passed through, clean, unremarkable, Daniel took a slow breath, letting it settle into his chest before releasing it, matching the rhythm of the space around him, because the work was not about staying tense, it was about staying ready. And as the hours moved quietly forward, as the light shifted and the terminal filled and emptied in waves, Daniel and Rex remained where they were needed, not searching for something extraordinary, not expecting another disruption, but prepared for it, because they had learned, in a moment that could have been dismissed, that sometimes the difference between what passes and what is stopped is not the system, not the process, but the simple choice to pay attention when something does not feel right, and to trust that feeling long enough to see where it leads. By late morning, the light had fully settled across the terminal, no longer pale and searching but steady, confident, stretching through glass and steel like it belonged there. And Daniel stood within it, not apart from the rhythm of the place, but aligned with it in a way that felt quieter than before, deeper somehow, as if something inside him had found its place without needing to be named. The conveyor continued its endless motion, bags arriving, passing, leaving, each one a story that might never be told, each one a possibility that might never be realized. And yet Daniel watched them all the same, not with suspicion, not with tension, but with a kind of respect for what could exist beneath the surface. Rex moved beside him, step for step, his presence unchanged, his attention unwavering. But there was something in the way Daniel now saw him that had shifted, not admiration, not surprise, but understanding, the kind that comes not from a single moment, but from what that moment reveals. A woman placed her suitcase onto the belt, offering a small, tired smile, and Daniel returned it with a nod, simple, human, grounded in the ordinary, and the bag passed through without interruption, just another piece in the flow, just another moment that did not demand more than attention. Rex did not pause, did not signal, and Daniel did not expect him to, because he had learned that what matters is not how often something happens, but that when it does, it is heard. Time moved quietly, not marked by urgency, but by continuity, the steady unfolding of a day that would look, from the outside, like any other. And yet Daniel knew that beneath that appearance, something had changed in a way that would not fade. With the hours, he thought briefly of the small carrier, of the quiet life within it, of the way it had been hidden not out of chaos, but out of intention, and how easily it could have passed through unnoticed, carried forward into a world that would never have known it had been there. And that thought did not bring anger. It did not bring relief. It brought something steadier, something more lasting. A recognition of how fragile the line is between what is seen and what is missed. Rex slowed. For a moment, not stopping, just adjusting his pace, his head turning slightly as a new bag approached, his senses engaging, measuring, and then releasing, the moment passing without incident. And Daniel felt the quiet affirmation in that too. That trust is not about constant alert. It is about consistency, about showing up fully in each moment whether something happens or not. the terminal breathed around them. Voices rising and falling, footsteps echoing softly against polished floors, announcements weaving through the air with practiced calm. And within it all, Daniel and Rex remained steady, not searching for disruption, not expecting another signal, but ready for it, because readiness is not tension, it is presence. Daniel's hand rested briefly on Rex's neck again, the gesture as natural as breath, and Rex leaned into it just enough to acknowledge, a silent exchange that carried more than words ever could, because what they shared was not built on commands or responses, it was built on trust, on the quiet understanding that when one speaks, the other listens, even when nothing is said. A group of travelers passed through, their voices soft, their movements unhurried, and the line continued, unbroken, the system functioning as it was meant to, efficient, reliable, consistent, and yet Daniel no longer saw it as complete on its own, because he understood now that it was only as strong as the awareness within it, only as effective as the people who chose to pay attention when something did not fit. He glanced once toward the far end of the terminal, where the light had grown brighter, reflecting off the wide windows, and for a moment, he allowed himself to stand in that quiet space between action and stillness, not thinking ahead, not looking back, just present. Rex shifted beside him, aligning once more, steady, ready, exactly where he needed to be, and Daniel felt that same steadiness settle into himself, not forced, not deliberate, just there. The conveyor moved, the day moved, everything continued exactly as it should, and yet within that continuity, there was a quiet truth that remained, something that did not need to be spoken to exist, that sometimes the smallest